speak English in a conference, so I beg for mercy. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to thank Professor Ivo Astad-Ibri for his kind invitation to the Young Latin American Peirce Society to present a roundtable at this prestigious event. I also wish to congratulate Professor Ivo and his closest collaborators for the 20th edition of this conference. Knowing how difficult it is to sustain an academic activity that requires such work and dedication over time. In terms of Peirce's philosophy, creating research communities is one of the most praiseworthy tasks. Professor Ibri is also the honorary president of the Latino-American Peirce Society. Thank you very much. Well, as I'm coordinating this session, I'm obliged to introduce myself. Briefly, I will say that I have a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tucumán, Argentina, under the supervision of Jaime Noviola. At that university, I am in charge of the chair in Geology. I coordinate the Persian Studies group in Argentina, and chair the Latin American Peirce Society. I am also president of the Philosophical Association of the Argentine Republic. The title of my exposition is Rereading C.S. Peirce's Photometric Researches. Introduction. When we study the work of the scientific philosopher, we are often tempted to ignore, or at least minimize, the importance of his non-philosophical research by falsely assuming that there is nothing of philosophical interest in it. A linear look at the history of science and its uninterrupted advance may decree the early obsolescence of such works. Somewhat may be true of Peirce's photometric researches, the only book he ever published. However, in my opinion, this work should not be neglected. Peirce claimed that every step in the history of science is a lesson of logic, and I personally think that it was his own activity as a professional scientist, coupled with his great capacity for theorizing, that made it possible to forge his philosophical ideas about knowledge. Such ideas were bold enough to break with the Cartesian and Kantian tradition on the one hand, and highly creative on the other. Likewise, his accurate criticism of metaphysicians who reflect without taking into account the facts or the way things are, undoubtedly come from the scientific practice to which Peirce devoted himself practically from his childhood. These considerations led me to wish to delve into his photometric researches in order to scrutinize the possible origin of some of his fundamental ideas. The task is not a simple one, as it will be seen. What I present below are partial advances of an ongoing research that includes the annotated translations to the text into Spanish. The book. As an assistant to the Harvard Observatory.
Catalina,
Yes?
sorry to interrupt you. Sorry. We will share your paper as well in the screen.
Oh, I thought I was doing already. Okay.
Not really. Start now.
It's okay?
Don't see your paper yet.
Try again.
You need to
problem is
click. You need
the
to
bar
click.
disappeared.
You need to open your file and then click on it. And then it will be able to appear on the screen.
It's open. My paper is open, but I don't find
It's only
the
you
bar
need to
with
be,
options.
yeah,
I only see squares with your faces. So I'm trying to find the way to return. Wait a minute. May I get away the room and come back? Could I?
yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay, now it's working.
Oh, so sorry. The book. As an assistant to the Harvard Observatory at the USA Coast Survey, Peirce was charged with observing stars between 40 and 50 degrees north declination. He carried out with his work between 1872 and 1875 and produced a report of these observations that was finally published in 1878. The book was edited by Wilhelm Engelmann in Leipzig as Volume 9 of the Annals of the Astronomical Observatory of Harvard College. Photometric researches is formally, or is supposed to be, a catalog of stellar magnitudes, but they are much more than that. Peirce states in a letter to Arthur Searle, Secretary of the Harvard Observatory, I consider, wait a minute, some cookies appear. I consider the immediate publication of the photometric researches important. They are intended not merely to commemorate facts to the astronomical world, but also to inculcate ideas. If there happens to elapse a sufficient time for their due digestion before the photometric stomach receives anything else of importance, I am in hopes they may acquire a certain influence to the current of research in this direction. Thus, we can see that Peirce intends to offer more than a mere record of observations. He wants to inculcate ideas. The work was assigned to Peirce by Joseph Wilmot, then director of the observatory. As an assistant to the Coast Survey, Peirce was simultaneously conducting gravimetric and geodetic research. It was a period of his life marked by overwork and marital difficulties. Peirce managed, however, to devote himself also to logical philosophical research, which was his main interest. In this field, we can point out as important his series of articles, Illustrations of the Logic of Science in Popular Science Monthly, in which his famous articles, The Fixation of Belief and How to Make Our Ideas Clear, appear. The content of the book is divided into 5 chapters. First, the sensation of light. Second, on the numbers of stars of different degrees of brightness. Third, original observations. 4, comparisons of the different observers. 5, on the form of the galactic cluster. As Peirce states, the design of the observations was to obtain the magnitudes of all the stars in Argelander's unirometria between 40 and 50 degrees of north declination. Some 368 stars, but later Peirce expanded the plan and observed approximately 100 more stars that he considered of interest. It should be noted that each star was observed several times. Anyone who looks at the night sky will notice that the stars have different degrees of brightness. Hipparchus of Nicaea elaborated a star catalog and established a magnitude scale ranging from 1 to 6, where 1 corresponds to the brightest stars, while 6 corresponds to the least bright ones. This scale of Hipparchus, although counterintuitive, is maintained in the main to the present day. Galileo was the first to observe with his telescope in 1609 a star with a magnitude greater than 6. And it should be clarified, according to correct corrections, the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, has a negative magnitude of minus 1.46. Other astros, such as the Moon, the Sun, or Venus, also have negative magnitudes. The zero of the scales correspond to the star Vega. Peirce developed in this first chapter a distinction between nominal light and phenomenal light, clarifying that photometric investigations deal with phenomenal light, that is, with apparent magnitudes. Between physical energy flow, we could say, and human perceptions, there is no linear correlation. Peirce appeals here to recent research in experimental psychology, specifically to Fechner, to explain that our sensations fail to capture the real difference in magnitude of the stimulus, in this case, the flow of light energy, but go far behind in a logarithmic relationship. In order not to go into too much technical detail, let us say that between stars of magnitude 1 and 2, the difference is not that the former are twice as bright as the latter, but we do not manage to see that there is a real difference of 100 to 1. The crucial point for Peirce will be that we can, knowing the laws that our perception obeys, know that this is so. Today, there are very sophisticated apparatus to capture the actual flow of energy, but this was not so in Peirce's time. That is why he points out that these photometric investigations refer to phenomenal light, that is, to apparent magnitudes. There is a further complication in our perception of the brightness of stars. It varies according to the color of the star observed. Peirce explains in detail these differences in our sensation of light in each case. In addition to making the planned observations, Peirce compared his with almost all existing catalogs, both ancient and contemporary. Peirce called these comparisons with the observations of Ptolemy, Jules Verne, Tycho Brahe, William Herschel, John Herschel, Ludwig Seidel, Hevelius and M. Schmidt, as well as R.J. Lander and Hynes, historical investigations. This is not a mere historical curiosity, but the effective comparison which has been recorded by different observers in order to stabilize the number as approximately accurate as possible, The ideal of accuracy in science has to be confronted with all the inaccuracies actually operating in scientific measurement, with these ineliminable errors and with the multiplicity of observers. Far from drawing a skeptical conclusion regarding our knowledge of the real world, Peirce learns that only communal work can aspire to arrive at a stable result. Third, the instrument. In chapter 3, Peirce gives a detailed description of the instrument he used. My observations, Peirce says, have been made with a Zollner's astrophotometer. Though the principle of this instrument is well known, I might remind, it's not working. I might remind that an artificial star is thrown into the field of a telescope and its brightness is reduced by the rotation of Noether primes until it matches in brightness any real star which is in the field at the same time. The Noether prism being furnished with a graduated circle, the radius of the reduction of the light is calculated from the reading. A third nickel with an interposed quartz plate cut perpendicular to its axis makes it possible to alter the color of the artificial star, and this third nickel is also furnished with a graduated circle. The instrument referred to is the photometer designed by Johann Carl Friedrich Zollner. Only 22 copies were built in the world, and although Peirce states that the principle of its instrument is well known, in fact, historians rely to a large extent on Peirce's valuable descriptions of the difficulties of its operation. Zollner's photometer requires great skill, a lot of work, and a long time for each measurement. The use of the color variator was very difficult and its scale imprecise. Peirce's assistants in this task often complain about the excessive work they were subjected to. As if these difficulties were not enough, there were also the vagaries of the weather and the consequent variation in the visibility of the observed stars. Looking at Peirce's work from a broader perspective, we may wonder at what point in the history of science these photometric investigations by Peirce are situated and how much value they have. According to Henshaw, Peirce can be considered as the first major American photometrist because of his pioneering photometric observations at Harvard and Washington between the years 1871 to 1875. However, it should be noted that these observations are situated at a key point in the history of astronomy, when we can finally consider the Copernican revolution to be complete with an effective replacement of all the theses of Ptolemaic astronomy by new ones. Copernicus by no means personally completed this change, the change he initiated, but was the astronomers of the 19th century who finally achieved it. Beyond the anecdotal fights of a vain Galileo with obfuscated Aristotelians, it is necessary to say with Geoffrey Guillemin that there is a silent revolution that will really change the old astronomy for a new one. He does not consider Copernican revolution as a substitution of astronomical theories that would go from 1543 to 1687, but the complex cognitive ampliative process of increasing expansion even longer, through which simultaneously the Ptolemaic theses are eliminated by substitution one by one at different times and by different measurement procedures, and replaced by theses that are more and more precise, accurate, and reliable. I call the whole process the silent revolution. The inner role of measurement in scientific revolution is, on the contrary, a matter of daily reflection for Peirce, who worked professionally as a metronome, both in the studies of the pendulum and in astronomy. And a highlight of this silent development is the substitution of qualities for quantities in the study of stellar magnitudes. The field had remained more or less identical since antiquity. Copernicus was no more careful in his measurements and made no more observations than Ptolemy, nor did he design and use better instruments than Hipparchus had employed. Post-Copernican astronomers were concerned with other matters, although Tycho Brahe and Kepler should be signed out for being the first to realize that more precise observations were needed to decide between rival astronomical systems. Peirce stands then at the turning point between modern astronomy and the contemporary astrophysics that would quickly flourish. Finally, some systemic conclusions. Peirce's photometric researches are not just another stellar catalog. They constitute an exhaustive study of the errors in stellar brightness measurement in order to reduce them by mathematical procedures. In my opinion, there are two main epistemic conclusions that Peirce draws from his scientific work, although I can point out and develop others if I had a little more time. I can. The crucial importance of research methods over temporal results. The second, fallibilism. As for the first, Peirce became an obsessive improver of methods. In this sense, his main interest was the logic of science. He explored all possible functions of the hypothesis in science. In relation to induction, he devoted himself to the study of probability. He also developed deductive logic to its present scientific level with practically no connection to Frege. He introduced veritative functional analysis, quantifiers, a system with a single connective, and a system of graphical logic, among others, contributions to the discipline. In his broad view of logic, he practically founded contemporary semiotics, which currently plays a very important role in many areas. Second, as for fallibilism, Peirce tells us that fallibilism is the doctrine that our knowledge is never absolute, but always swims, as it were, in a continuum of uncertainty and of indeterminacy. Now, the doctrine of continuity is that all things so swim in. In my opinion, in a 19th century full of absolutists and infallibilists, Peirce was able to swim against the current only because he came from a professional practice that put him in daily contact with measurement or error and with the infinitesimal continuity of measurements. Hence, Peirce characterizes truth as the final opinions of investigators who are firmly faithful to their methods. He does so in a paragraph he writes in the same year of the publication of his photometric investigations. He says, on the other hand, all the followers of science are fully persuaded that the processes of investigation, if only pushed far enough, will give one certain solution to every question to which can be applied. For example, one man may investigate the velocity of light by studying the transits of Venus and the aberration of the stars, another by the oppositions of Mars. They may at first obtain different results, but as each perfects his method, and its processes, the result will move steadily together toward the destined center. It is because of statements like this that I believe that reading Peirce's scientific works can help us to understand what he thought, insofar as they provide us with a luminous context to his daily activity, his hard struggle against natural facts in order to bring to light their reasonableness. This is all. Thank you very much. I apologize for my English. Thank you. No dejo de compartir. That's all.
Well, Catalina, I really greatly appreciate the essay that you have presented. It is unusual for anyone to study Peirce's photometric research. Actually, this may be the first paper I ever heard about this topic. And so when the photometric research were published in the volumes of the writings, that was before I came to the Peirce project. That was a long time ago. And I always wondered whether the Peirce project had done a good job publishing the photometric research, because of course it was a selection of the report. It was not the entire thing that was done. Did you, I missed the very beginning, did you study that document out of an original, or did you use the writings?
I have an exemplar of the.
Oh, you have an exemplar of the
a gift from Jaime Nubiola. Thank you very much, Andre, for your kind words. I am very happy to see you again.
I am so too.
Instead of the screen. I forgot to say that this roundtable, where the speakers are going to speak one after the other for approximately 20 minutes each, and they give way to exchange of questions and comments with all the listeners. I'm very grateful for the presence of all of you at this table. So I will answer later. Now is the turn of Paniel Reyes Cárdenas. Paniel was awarded his PhD in philosophy by the University of Sheffield. In his PhD thesis, he researched the place of the scholastic realism in Peirce's pragmatist philosophy under the supervision of Professor Christopher Hoogway and Steve Makin. Paniel joins as lecturer and researcher in UPAEP, People's Autonomous University of Puebla State, Puebla, Mexico, where he is chair of philosophy of language and medieval philosophy. Though Paniel's approach is centered in the pragmatist tradition, he has a wide range of philosophical interests. Paniel has published papers on philosophy of mathematics, metaphysics, medieval philosophy, philosophy of religion, and German idealism. Paniel has participated in academic conferences in many different countries and is founder of the first Latino-American Society. And he speaks English better than me. Paniel.
Okay, thank you so much indeed, dear Kathy. It's so nice to, I mean, I'm very impressed by your presentation, so probably people will get a bit underwhelmed by mine now. I am, just let me kick off with a word of thanks to Professor Ivo Ibri and the organization of the 20th International Meeting on Pragmatism, which is a fantastic event that has a long tradition of gathering all the pragmatist scholars and most especially Peirce scholars, of course. It's an honor for me to be here presenting again. I wish I wish we can get to see each other in the flesh at some point in the future. But for now, it's really nice to see you all, and thank you for attending to this session. And thank you, Catalina, for inviting me to be part of this roundtable on pragmatism and, sorry, of the Peirce Latin-American Society. Okay, so now I have around 20 slides or so, and my idea is just to shape a very general proposal of, you know, this what I'm going to present here is somehow not the result, but the aim of probably some of the time I'm spending at the moment as a visiting lecturer, visiting professor at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. And they invited me very kindly, and this is giving me the time and the space to finish a few projects. One of them is a book on Josiah Royce, on community, that I'm hopefully going to finish in the next few weeks. Myself to just carry on in this evolutionary cosmology research, which is getting me really excited. Anyway, I'm going to kickstart, and just to say, well, we have here the very handsome logo of the Peirce Latin-American Society, done by a very good friend, Dora Ivonne Tamayo. She's done a great job by you know, doing these symbols that resemble the categories as well as the graphs and many other aspects of Peirce's thought and the signs in themselves, you know, the triadic sign. So it's a really nice logo, and especially a really nice symbol for the purposes of this table. So I'm going to try to give you a really very, let me show you the outline of the talk. So what I'm going to try to do is just to, you know, tell very briefly the story of contemporary cosmology, the general background of this cosmology, and then I'll try to delve into some of Peirce's body of beliefs that follow from his use of the pragmatic maxim. And as you, well, I did study this in a lot more depth in my book Scholastic Realism, Key to Understanding Peirce's Philosophy, that was published in 2018 by Peter Lang in Oxford. And the idea is to give a little summary of some of the body of beliefs that are a result of applying the pragmatic maxim. And in this, I follow the school of my supervisor, Chris Hugway, who believes that basically what constitutes strict pragmatism is the use of the maxim mainly. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that the use of the maxim gives us an outcome of practical bearings, a body of beliefs, and this body of beliefs includes Peirce's metaphysical doctrines as well as his system of categories, and I'll try to explain that. Then I will try to present Peirce's cosmology not only as a body of beliefs, but as a method. And in presenting it so, what I'm trying to achieve is show that how relevant is Peirce's cosmological thought for contemporary cosmology. It's not only an interesting piece, you know, of historical interest, but it's also very relevant for contemporary cosmology. And in being so, it could still, you know, give a nicer framework to contemporary cosmology than the ones that are. And in doing this, I'm a little bit, you probably notice that I will be tilted towards a criticism of the Newtonian background or the Newtonian heritage that still governs or dominates contemporary cosmology. And in doing this, I'm along with other people, you know, we're relevant cosmologists of our day, such as Liz Molin, who I'm going to quote very shortly. Anyway, well, that's the general background. That's the outline of the talk. So I'm not going to try to come down to details, because as you know, this is a very detailed story and it's complex. I'm just going to try to sort of shape it really very generally, very amply. And after that, I'll try to show Peirce's relevance towards these stories, okay? So what I'm trying to say is present models of the universe hold two fundamental premises. You know, on the one hand, you have the cosmological principle and the dominant role of gravitation. Well, sorry, cosmological principle, the cosmological constant, which appears to be a very important conceptual device that is kind of abductively proposed to sort of explain the state of the universe. And of course, against the steady state defenders of the 20th century, the current paradigm of cosmology is, of course, comes down to the general story of the Big Bang. And as you know, Big Bang was a pejorative. It was supposed to be a mockery of this story of the reckoning of the universe. Perhaps the first official title of the current Big Bang device or battery of theories that explain the origins of the cosmological origins of the universe came with Lemaitre, this I think he's a Belgian priest who basically proposed the idea of the primordial atom. So the idea of the primordial atom is actually the first, as it were, title, or it was the first thing which this theory was baptized with. But of course, this happened at the same time as it was becoming apparent that the dominant role of gravitation, the formation of the universe, was decisive for the explanation of all the forces in the universe, and particularly gravitation occupies a very important place. And of course, the work of Hubble is very relevant. By Hubble, the cosmological principle holds that if a large enough sample of galaxies is considered, the universe looks the same from all positions and all directions in space. And this property of the general universe is grouped into characteristics. One is being said that the universe is isotropic, which means that everywhere from you look, every corner of the observable universe will have more or less the same distribution of visible matter and visible organization of that matter. But all for anisotropy of the universe, which means that not only the visible aspect of that universe is equivalent in different areas of the universe, but also that the laws of physics are pretty much the same in every corner of the visible universe we see. And to explain the isotropic nature and the anisotropic nature of the universe, well, different theories have been proposed. And of course, the most reasonable one, the most abductively powerful one is that there's a common principle to all this story. The second point of agreement is that gravitation, or in that days, in 1998, when it was apparent after the research of standard candles, or 1A supernovas, it was accepted that the universe is accelerating in its expansion, and this acceleration presents another player another important player in the cosmological story, which is what we call that energy, or is an anti-gravitational principle, which seems to be the most important force in shaping the universe in this very moment. And of course, as little do we know about, more than the name, we don't have much information about what that energy is, and the state of our ignorance is very clear, and the number of hypotheses that are being proposed, they will have to take on account all the relationships of the cosmological stories, by and large. According to Einstein's general theory of relativity, which is a geometric interpretation of gravitation, sort in the space about it. The curvature of space is described by a form of non-Euclidean geometry. And so in general, so we have a story of the universe. We have some reliable data that the universe, well, we have the story of the Big Bang, which is the common origin of the universe that explains the uniform aspect of the universe, but at the same time we have evidence of its rapid expansion, and along with theories of inflation that explain the accelerate the expansion at the beginning. And then we have also some kind of framework concepts like the geometry that we use to understand that, and also the sort of methodology. And what I want to say today, and I'll try to do it as briefly as I can and as clearly as I can, is that Peirce's epistemology seems to be a good candidate. Peirce's epistemology, Peirce's metaphysics seems to be a good candidate to substitute a framework that doesn't seem to be good enough to explain and integrate all these different aspects of the cosmological stories. Okay. This is the cosmic microwave background in some of the best versions that we have of it. Obviously, the very small variations in this primordial soup, which is the first light that came out of the universe, and now we can only appreciate it by the background radiation, the background noise that appears in different surveying instruments. As you know, for sure, Penzias and Wilson, they thought that this was just disposable background noise, and little they know, to their surprise, that was going to be the evidence of the sound of the explosion of the Big Bang, and in some way or another, a more important piece of data to explain those primordial conditions of what Lemaitre will call the primordial atom. So I'll read these to not stop too much, and of course in the Q&A session you can ask me whatever you like about it, but the idea is not to stop too much on it. It's just to present the general background. All of the matter and energy in the universe was concentrated in a very dense state from which it exploded, as it were, with the resulting expansion continuing until the present moment. The Big Bang is dated between 10 and 20 billion years ago, and most likely 13,799 million years ago, sorry. No, 13.7 billion years ago, sorry about that. In this initial state, the universe was very hot and contained a thermal superquarks, electrons, photons, and other elementary particles that form what is called the standard model of particle physics. The temperature rapidly decreased, falling from 1013 degrees Kelvin to what is today which is probably 2.7 Kelvin degrees. As the universe cooled, the quarks condensed into protons and neutrons, the building blocks of atomic nuclei. Some of these were converted into helium nuclei by fusion, and the relative abundance of hydrogen and helium is used as a test of the theory. After many millions of years, the expanding universe, at first a very hot gas, thin and cool enough to condense into individual galaxies and then stars. Okay. And of course, as you might know, some of the elements of the periodic table that we have today are formed in the natural fusion processes in stars. But of course, some of the elements of the periodic table are not formed naturally in the stars. They are formed in the big explosions called supernovae. Now, let's delve into Peirce's metaphysics, because I don't have much time left. I just realized. So Peirce is well known, as you know, as the founder of pragmatism. But pragmatism, what is pragmatism? It's a body of beliefs, or it's a method of inquiry? First and foremost, it's a method of inquiry and depends on Peirce's pragmatic maxim. Peirce believed that the benefits of these methods relied in the achievement of self-controlled inquiry. Peirce spent his lifetime trying to achieve what he called scientific metaphysics, as opposed to ontological metaphysics. Scientific metaphysics is a realism, and most particularly, as I'd like to defend, as you might imagine, it's an scholastic realism of the sort of a medieval scribe, very much as Scotus's realism of common nature and hexaetis. Scientific metaphysics is opposed to a priori metaphysics, and Peirce finished his project of scientific metaphysics with his theory of evolutionary cosmology. So a natural body of beliefs and doctrines that follow up from the appliance of the pragmatic maxim can be a token sample of this evolution of his thought is given in evolutionary cosmology. So now, cosmology from an evolutionary point of view is integrated by two kinds of conceptual ammunitions, or a battery of conceptual conceptions. Cosmology, first and foremost, is a metaphysical story of nature. Physics is a cosmology as long as reckons a description of what physically there is in a rational manner. And Peirce meant to have an evolutionary approach to cosmology. He coined three doctrines to explain this movement, this kind of development, and this kind of becoming of the universe by integrating three metaphysical doctrines. The doctrine of diechism, which is the belief that there is a fact of the universe that is started off by entropy and chance, and real vagueness is something that we have to account for. Is given in our experience, in our experiential report of nature. And secondly, synechism, which is a doctrine that picks on the fact that out of chance and randomness, patterns might emerge and create law-like behavior in the universe, and this behavior is given in terms of habits, and these habits are developing continuities. And finally, agapism, which accounts for the growing crystallization, in Peirce's words, of mind and concrete reasonableness, and the strong confirmation of those patterns. Okay, these I'm going to try to summarize here. Peirce's metaphysics relies on a system of a threefold categorical structure. As you know, the three categories: firstness, or possibility; secondness, or facts, or pure facts; and thirdness, as regularity. Of course, there's different ways of characterizing Peirce's categories, but I'm choosing this one because I think it's the more suitable to understand how the story of the evolutionary cosmology was devised by the use of these categories. categories. Of course, the best way of describing the evolution of these patterns, as for example, Fernando Salamea has nicely showed, is a topological development of the phenomenology of categories given in the expression of the universe. So what we're forming here is an a posteriori metaphysics, basically. That's why Peirce will call it scientific metaphysics, because of course it will be confronted by predictable habits of action or predictable habits of expectation. So, well, of course, this is just an explanation of what are the elements of the system. But what I like to say here, I'm going to try to skip a little bit, is that what we're getting here out of Peirce's development of a body of beliefs out of the use of the pragmatic maxim is something very similar to what happened to his architectonic system. So the architectonic system is a classification of science not based in the products of science, but on the activities that we do while we do different intellectual operations of a xenoscopic, ample nature, or an ideoscopic, and particular, or a specific nature. Well, in some way, the Sino-Pythagorean system of categories will also give us a framework to understand the development of the different battery of concepts that are going to be relevant for not only for Peirce's cosmology, but for cosmology in general. And this is contrasted with an a priori metaphysics. For example, there as conceived can criticize a system of criticize metaphysics by conceiving first and foremost metaphysics as some sort of a priori set of categories. And let me quote Chris Hoogway here. If we make use of results obtained through logically monitored empirical or metaphysical inquiry, then we risk incorrigible error. We might use an incorrect empirical theory, which leads us to adopt mistaken procedures of inquiry, which in turn confirm our acceptance of that empirical theory. And maybe some of you see where I'm going. Where I'm going is just to try to understand what is going on with contemporary cosmology. Seems to be still affected by a framework of Newtonian epistemology or Newtonian a priori metaphysics. Why? Because most of all, Newtonian metaphysics conceives the elements of the framework of contemporary cosmology as fixed a priori elements of those. So for example, the way Newtonian physics conceives the continuum of space and time, or the way that Newtonian epistemology conceives or laws of nature. It conceives them as an a priori kind of presupposition that doesn't change. So one of the big problems I see, or try to explore in contemporary cosmology, is that many of the stories of inflation, Big Bang, many of the frameworks that we use there, many of the theories that are shaped there, use an epistemology that tries to apply preconceived laws that don't change. And Olin has seen this very clearly. Peirce is very relevant today for cosmology because Peirce questions this or naturalizes this conception, this Newtonian conception of law. As you know, for Peirce, laws are habits that are statistically made stronger by the crystallization of its own patterns. So every law of physics, even the stronger laws of physics, are crystallizations of habits. So this is a way of criticizing the dogma of unchangeable laws of nature. And of course, just like the universe evolves cosmologically, the laws of nature that are present in the universe can evolve as well. And this also,
Daniel,
yes,
sorry,
I'm just about,
5 minutes.
yes, yeah, I'm just about to finish now. I'm actually just going to go to the conclusions now and just say that some of the conclusions that we can draw from this is, or some of the lessons that we could sort of show to show, in order to show Peirce's relevance for today, we can say that there are different ways of making metaphysics and epistemology of science. Some of them are in an a priori manner or some of them by attending to scientific practice and scientific inquiry, like Peirce did. That's why I love the photometric researches that have been presented to us, because by establishing this pragmatic maxim, Peirce was also practicing actual experimental science. And the problem of a priori metaphysics is that falls in some kind of circular. Scientific metaphysics, as opposed to it, is a way of not blocking the way of the road of inquiry. Finally, evolutionary cosmology is the result of an explanatory need expressed in the answer to ever-growing questions about reality, confronted with experience. And finally, contemporary cosmology needs a more powerful account of evolutionary patterns. Such patterns include the formulation of laws and the problems of the scale from the micro-universe to the macro universe. And that's all for today. Sorry for taking longer than expected. I always find it really difficult to, summarize this kind of ideas. But muito obrigado, muchas gracias. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, panel. This is the time for Jorge Alejandro Flores.
Okay, thank you, Catalina.
Wait a minute. Jorge
Yes.
Alejandro Flores has a PhD in philosophy from Southern Illinois University under the supervision of Douglas Anderson, professor of the Department of Philosophy of the University of Caldas, Colombia, director of the Doctorate in Philosophy at the University of Caldas, current editor of the Cuadernos de Sistemática Peirceana, founded by Fernando Salamea. He's the author of several articles and books. His main interest has revolved around ancient philosophy, epistemology, logic, semiotics, and American pragmatism. Welcome, Jorge.
Okay, Catalina, thank you, and thank you all the organizers of this international meeting of pragmatism, especially to Professor Ibri, who invited us today to this roundtable. I also apologize for my English. I am not very fluent. Even though I study in the US, I finished my studies many years ago, and I haven't practiced my English enough. So I'm gonna read a paper that I'm gonna share with you right now. And the title, at the beginning, I use the title categorical order and the semiotic classification of logical inference, but I only have time to develop the first part, the categorical order of the logical inferences. I'm not going to talk about the semiotic classification. Okay. What is the categorical order of logical inferences? Is abduction firstness, induction secondness, and deduction thirdness? Despite the fact that Peirce's characterization of the three categories and Peirce's classification of the three types of logical inferences are some of the topics he elaborated the most, there is not a clear convergence between both topics. There is no doubt that abduction is fairness, but the place of deduction and induction is not clear. Several times along his career, Peirce located induction as a second and deduction as a third. Although in 1903, he hesitated about this order, he kept induction as second and deduction as third. However, there are several other evidences that indicate that deduction must be second and induction third. To begin with, I show some passages in which Peirce sustained that induction is second and deduction third. Next, I show the passage from the Harvard lecture in 1903 in which he hesitated about that order. Finally, I will show some evidences to defend that the correct order should place deduction as second and induction as third. The first part, Peirce's defense of induction as second and deduction as third. In a new list of categories, 1868, Peirce located abduction as first, induction as second, and deduction as third because of their similarities to likeness, icon, index, and symbols, the well-known semiotic triad. Quote, in hypothesis, something like the conclusion is proved. There is the premise form, a likeness of the conclusion, end quote. Instead, in induction, quote, the premises are index of the conclusion. And in deduction, quote, the conclusion is represented by the premises as by a general sign under which it is contained. In his article, Deduction, Induction, and Hypothesis of 1878, he claimed that that abduction, quote, we find that in certain respects, two objects have a strong resemblance and inferred that they resemble one another strongly in other respects. Hypothesis is a weak kind of argument, end quote. Accordingly, abduction is still characterized as an inference that behaves as an icon that resembles its object. Therefore, he is considering abduction as fairness. Abduction and induction are both synthetic or amplified inference at that time, whereas deduction is the only analytic inference up to this date. The proximity of abduction and induction indicates that after abduction follows induction. Therefore, he is considering it as a second. Abduction is the weakest one, deduction is the strongest one, induction has a middle strength, therefore is the second one. Thus, induction is located at that time between hypothesis and deduction. In sundry logical conception, that is in the syllabus from 1903, he also defined abduction close to an icon. Quote, it is recognized that the phenomena are like, that is, constitute an icon of, a replica of a general conception or symbol, a replica of a symbol, end quote. He does not say that explicitly, but if abduction is an icon, then deduction and induction must be index and symbol respectively, as he claimed it in a new list. Later on, in an entry of the logic notebook of August 1906, Peirce indicates that the triad of the last trichotomy is the following in that particular order. Abducent, that's the name he used at that time for that triad. Abducent, or assurance of unusual. Second is indocent, or assurance of experience. And third is deducent, or assurance of form. Hence, he keeps thinking of abduction as first, induction as second, and deduction as third. Similarly, in a draft to a letter to Lady Welby in December 1908, in which Peirce enlisted the triad of the 10 trichotomies, upon which he will try to derive 66 types of signs, he said that it must be divided into assurance of instincts, assurance of experience, and assurance of form, which clearly represent abduction, instinct, induction experience, and deduction form. Consequently, as late as 1908, Peirce still struggled with the categorical order of logical inferences and kept thinking induction as second and deduction as third. The second part of the presentation, Peirce's hesitation of the categorical order of logical inferences. In a draft for his 1903 Harvard lecture on pragmatism, Peirce claims that he will classify induction as second and deduction as third, but that he is not yet sure. In his own word, he said, but if were I asked today as to the connection between the three categories and the three modes of inference, I am forced to confess that it is obscure. Now, I said abduction, or the suggestion of an explanatory theory, is inference through an icon, and it is that connected with fairness. Induction, or trying how things will act, is inference through an index, and it is thus connected with secondness. Deduction, or recognition of relation of general ideas, is inference through symbol, and it is thus connected with fairness. But as years roll on, I began to waver this position, and here I beg you to permit a personal explanation. I represented induction to be connected with the third category and deduction with the second. It is needless to say that I had reasons for this which seemed strong to me then and which seem strong to me now. At present, I am somewhat disposed to revert to my original opinion, but I will leave the questions undecided. Although Peirce left the matter undecided, I claim that there are reasons to hold with greater confidence that deduction is second and induction third. This is not a simple issue regarding speculative grammar or the classification of signs, but an issue that reverberates in the whole architectonic of Peirce's system. Accordingly, the categories must be reflected in the whole architectonic. Therefore, logical inferences must be categorically clear in the three branches of normative science of logic or semiotics, namely speculative grammar critics and methodeutics. This is the third part and the final part of the paper. Arguments in favor of deduction as second and induction as third. Peirce's xenoscopic categories are relational. Fairness is that which is relative only to itself. Second is the order of fairness, is non-ego, is opposing party. Finally, thirdness is that which relates fairness as secondness and secondness. It is their mediator. If in logical inferences we have abduction as fairness, the question we need to raise is whether induction or deduction is the opposing party of the suggestive and problematic inference. What is the secondness that opposes to abduction? The most different inference of abduction is deduction. They are different in all possible manners. Whereas abduction is suggestive, problematic, conjectural, and possible, deduction is necessary and secure. They have nothing in common. They are dyads that opposes to each other. Hence, we have to think of induction as the third element that relates abduction and deduction. Induction is an ampliative inference, not as novel and free as abduction is. Induction requires accumulation of data in order to establish the ratio in which certain facts occur. Moreover, induction concludes a general proposition or rule that will work as general principle for deduction. So induction is similar to abduction in some respects and provides the foundation for deduction to work. Furthermore, categories have been characterized morally as possible, actual, and necessitant or necessary. In that sense, abduction has been considered as first for being possible, deduction as third for being necessary, while secondness corresponds to induction. However, if we pay attention to the conclusion of each inference, we find that the conclusion of an induction is a rule or a general statement, the necessitant, whereas the conclusion of a deduction is a fact or a result, so something actual. This reading is supported by the manner in which Peirce organized the cosmological triad in his metaphysical articles for the monies, Tychism, Anankism, and Agapism. Tychism represents chance and possibility, namely, is close to abduction. Anankism, which is the second in that metaphysical triad, Anankism represents necessity and determinism, which is the way in which deduction behaves. Agapism represents the solidarity of the community. That is the way in which I imagine the particular cases that participate in an induction collaborate in order to achieve a general conclusion. Finally, the categorical principle of degeneracy applied to the logical inference also indicates that abduction is first, deduction second, and induction third. The categorical principle of degeneracy states that a first cannot have subdivisions and remains unique. A second has two subdivisions, the first of which is degenerate second, while the other is a genuine second. And a third can have three subdivisions, two degenerate and one genuine third. In all his attempts at classifying types of inference, Peirce found no subdivision of abduction, but made, so if he doesn't find any subdivision of abduction, it's clearly a first. Abduction is fairness, but made dyadic division of deduction and triadic divisions of induction. With regard to deduction, Peirce consistently said that it has two kinds, but he changed his mind about the nature of these kinds. In 1901, he stated that these kinds are corollarial deduction and theorematic deduction. Yet in 1903, he changed this dyad to probable deduction and necessary deduction, and he added that each of them can be subdivided into two divisions. Probable deduction can be divided into statistical deduction and probable deduction proper. However, Peirce never mentioned this subdivision of two kinds of probable deduction again, and I therefore assume that there is only one kind of probable deduction. On the other branch of the division, a necessary deduction can be divided into corollarial and theorematic. Peirce also changed this division when he said that the two kinds of deduction are explication, probable deduction, and demonstration, necessary deduction, which in turn are divided into corollarial and theorematic deduction. Therefore, I believe that the most consistent division of types of deduction is a dyadic division between probable or explicative deduction and necessary or demonstrative deduction, which in turn divides dyadically into corollarial and theorematic deduction. If there is a diagram to understand this better, as you can see, deduction is always divided into two. So this is an indication that deduction is second. Necessary deduction is the genuine type. So if this is the genuine type of deduction, it can be divided into two. Now the time on induction. Peirce was consistent in stating that there are three kinds of the induction, but he constantly changed their names and subspecies. I don't know how, I think my time is It's short, so probably I'm gonna
5
jump.
minutes. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm gonna show you the diagram better. Here's the diagram of the classification of type of inferences. Abduction doesn't have any time, any kind. It's a unique type of inference. Deduction is dyadic. Deduction is always triadic. Crude induction or rudimentary induction is the firstness of this thirdness that is induction. So as a firstness, it doesn't have subdivision. Qualitative induction is the secondness. So it has 2 types. And quantitative induction has 3 types. So for me, this indicates that the correct categorical order is that deduction is second and induction third, despite the fact that he keeps saying that deduction is a symbol or resemble a symbol, so it has to be a third, and induction resemble an index, so it has to be a second. Okay. Once the phenomenological categories and the principle of degeneracy have been applied to the 2 first branches of logic or semiotics, speculative grammar and critics, let me do the same for the third one, methodeutics. On the one hand, with respect to the 2 first branches, we have already mentioned some important aspects. The efforts of classifying the types of arguments are also an exercise of the speculative grammar. And Peirce's comments on the weakness of abduction and the strength of deduction are criteria of critics, whose main goal is to establish the relation of a sign with the object or its truth. On the other hand, methodeutics inquires on how to achieve truth by means of the scientific method. It consists mainly in the collaborative work of the 3 logical inferences, and the stages of the process show that abduction is first, deduction second, and induction third. Every inquiry starts with the conjecture of a hypothesis with which the surprising or unexpected fact can be explained. It is the context of discovery in science, according to Reichenbach names. Secondly, the necessary consequences of that hypothesis must be tracked deductively. It is the predictive moment of science in which empirical consequences of a hypothesis are thought of. Finally, those consequences must be corroborated or verified in the experience by means of the accumulation of empirical experiments. This is induction. It is the so-called context of justification according to Reichenbach too. To conclude, it is clear that deduction is second and induction third, mostly because of the categorical principle of degeneracy applied to the classification of types of inferences and the stages of the scientific method. Peirce's persistence on thinking induction as second and deduction as third was due to the similarity he found between the inferences and the semiotic triad of icon, index, and symbol. But although logical inferences are signs, they do not correspond exactly to that triad. Their similarities goes back to the categories. Abduction is firstness as an icon, deduction is secondness as index, and induction is thirdness as symbol. In a strict sense, all inferences are symbols. Their differences lie in the different modes of appealing to the 3 types of interpretants. But there is a topic I cannot develop at this time. I claim also that Peirce was wrong at locating the order of the triads of his late semiotics, in which assurance of experience or induction was second and assurance of form or deduction was third. I think we should change it, switch it. If we consider this order, or we consider this change, we can have better results in the classification of signs on his late attempts. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Just in time. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Now is the turn of Darin McNutt. Dr. Darin McNutt Costa is translator of Peirce's Obra Filosófica Reunida and author of Hombre, Signo y Cosmos. For 23 years, he was researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Universidad Veracruzana, Mexico, but now retired from the institutional academic world. 10 years ago, he created the YouTube channel La Fonda Filosófica, dedicated to the dissemination and philosophical reflection. This channel has a great repercussion in the Spanish world, Spanish-speaking world. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Kati. Good morning to everyone. What I'd like to share with you is the central part of a much larger article that I have written using Peirce's logic of relations to interpret a notoriously difficult and dense passages where Kierkegaard defines the self in the opening paragraphs of his book, The Sickness Unto Death. I think it's a very interesting application of Peirce's logic, and it's I believe that it's a much better reading than the standard Hegelian reading of these opening paragraphs of the sickness unto death. So I'm going to share a screen. So first, I'm going to briefly review Peirce's logic of relations. Peirce's philosophical categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness form the basis for an understanding of the logic of relations. Every phenomenon can be considered in relation to itself, monadically, in immediate relation to something else, a second, dyadically, or in relation to a second through the mediation of a third, triadically. A monadic character can be given in just one way, but dyadic and triadic relations can be given in diverse ways, which Peirce terms either degenerate or genuine. A genuine dyadic relation Peirce defines as a fact concerning two subjects, a single fact, not two separate facts. Cain killed Abel is an example. Hold on a second. Cain killed Abel is an example. The single fact expressed here requires the relation of the two. Had Abel never existed, Cain could never have been his murderer. Cain and Abel are sons of Adam and Eve. This is an example of Peirce, is a degenerate relation because two facts are simply brought together. If Abel had never existed, Cain would still be the son of Adam and Eve. Things are a bit more complicated with triadic relations. Peirce says every triad is either monadically degenerate, dyadically degenerate, or genuine. A monadically degenerate triad is one which results from the essence of three monads, its subjects. A dyadically degenerate triad is one which results from the conjunction of two dyads. A genuine triad is one which cannot be resolved in any such way. One of Peirce's favorite examples of a genuine triad is the relation of giving. A gives B to C. The dyadically degenerate form of this relation would be one composed of two dyads, A, B, and C. For example, A puts B on the table, and then C takes B. We have a triadic relation here because it is composed of three elements, but it is degenerate because it is composed of two dyads, two independent facts. Genuine relations have to do with one fact concerning the relates in question. What is missing in the dyadically degenerate triad is the mediating element between A and C that makes what is expressed be an act of giving. So with these preliminary remarks, we can move on to the opening of The Sickness Unto Death and to an interpretation of the self therein described in terms of Peirce's logic of relations. So in the opening paragraph of his text, Kierkegaard gives a nearly complete definition of the self. He says, the human being is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self, but what is the self? The self is a relation which relates to itself or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. The self is not the relation, but the relations relating to itself. Kierkegaard spends the rest of this brief first section, unpacking this rather dense formulation. In spite of its density, it is clear from the second part of the definition that there is a relation which is not the self. The part there where he says the self is not the relation, but the relations relating to itself. We learn in the following sentence that this relation is a synthesis of various pairs of elements, the infinite and the finite, the temporal and the eternal, freedom and necessity. Taking the latter pair, Kierkegaard tells us that to be human is to be neither entirely free nor entirely determined, but rather a synthesis of the two. In Peircean terms, a relation of two elements is a dyad. And as we saw above, a dyad can be either genuine or degenerate. If the freedom and necessity that make up a human being were a mere combination in which one could be given without the other, or in which one could be striven for and the other eliminated, we would have a degenerate relation. But Kierkegaard speaks not of a combination, but of a synthesis. Being human comprises a relation in which both elements are necessary, one not being possible without the other. This would be a genuine dyad. Looked at in this way, however, Kierkegaard tells us, a human being is not yet a self. Kierkegaard tells us that this basic or initial relation of contradictory pairs is a necessary but not sufficient condition of selfhood. Kierkegaard begins the second paragraph by introducing a third element. In a relation, he says, in a relation between two things, the relation is the third term in the form of a negative unity. The introduction of this third term brings us closer to selfhood, but we are still not there because the unity which the relation itself brings about is merely negative. Kierkegaard explains what he means by this by saying that the two elements in the relation relate to the relation and in the relation to that relation, and attempts to illustrate this with the following. He says, this is what it is from the point of view of soul, for soul and body to be in relation. This second paragraph is perhaps the most confusing of the entire book, but we can begin to make sense of it by returning to Peirce. I'm sorry. So we have a relation with three elements, the two elements and the relation itself, which makes it a triad. But it is in some way defective. It is, as Kierkegaard says, a merely negative unity. In Peirce's terminology, this negativity is expressed in terms of degeneracy. Recall that for triads, there are two possible grades of degeneracy, the conjunction of three monads and the conjunction of two dyads. The negative unity that Kierkegaard speaks of is a degenerate triad of the latter kind, the conjunction of two dyads. He says as much when he speaks of each relating to the relation as, for example, when the unity of soul and body is seen from the point of view or under the aspect of the soul. The soul relates to the soul-body relation in a negative or degenerate way, because though the body is included in the relation, it is seen from the soul's perspective as derivative or secondary, as something to be controlled or diminished. In short, as an inessential element for the being of the soul. This independence of the elements is what makes a relation degenerate. If sense is to be made of the synthesis of soul and body and not their mere combination, the three elements distributed between the two dyads must become a genuine triad. And this happens when a third, the relation itself in this case, unites the other two. This is effected not by soul, but by spirit. As Kierkegaard says, if on the other hand, the relation relates to itself, then this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. This relation, however, is not done relating. Kierkegaard tells us that the relation which is the self must either have established itself or been established by something else. If the self assumes the latter case, then in addition to being a relation that relates to itself, it relates in turn to that which has established the whole relation, which, though not explicitly stated, is assumed to be God. For Peirce, the highest and most evolved form of relation is a genuine triad, which, as we have shown, is the positive third that Kierkegaard calls the self. So why does Kierkegaard, having already accounted for the emergence of the self, introduce this additional act of relating? Does he intend to introduce an even higher order relation? If the self is a positive third term, the something else that establishes the whole relation and to which the self relates could be read as a fourth term. Is Kierkegaard then speaking of a tetradic relation? Peirce's reduction thesis states that every tetradic relation or fact about four objects can be analyzed into a compound of triadic relations. Assuming then that this relation is triadic, what does it add to our understanding of the self? Logically speaking, it adds nothing. The self as a positive third introduced at the end of the second paragraph is the highest or most evolved form of the human psyche from a functional or structural point of view. We could say that the argument up until this point answers the what question with which Kierkegaard begins. What is spirit? What is the self? But it does not answer what we can call the how question. How does the self carry out its function of relating? According to Kierkegaard, it does so either well or badly, or in Peircean terms, genuinely or degenerately. A self that, in addition to relating to itself, relates to that which established the whole is balanced and therefore healthy. A self not so related is imbalanced. It suffers a sickness that Kierkegaard calls despair. The rest of the book is a very detailed analysis of this condition. Now, given that the self is a triadic relation, we know that there are two forms of degeneracy. And in fact, Kierkegaard identifies two forms of what he calls authentic despair. The first form consists in the self not wanting to be itself, wanting to be rid of itself. In other words, refusing the work of relating. The second form is wanting to be itself, wanting all on its own to do the work of relating, the work of achieving equilibrium between the elements that it relates. These forms of existence are what Kierkegaard analyzes in the aesthetic and ethical registers, respectively, of such famous works as Either Or and Fear and Trembling. The religious register, which is the culmination of Kierkegaard's dialectic, corresponds in this context to the relation of the self with that which established the whole. Kierkegaard derives this relation from a consideration of the two forms of despair. He says, that is why there can be two forms of authentic despair. If the human self were self-established, there would only be a question of one form, not wanting to be itself, wanting to be rid of self. Since there are two forms of despair, the self cannot be self-established. In order to explain the facts at hand, not only that there are two forms of despair, but also that there are selves that achieve the relational equilibrium that characterizes health, Kierkegaard introduces the further relation of the self to that which established it. What it adds to our understanding of the self, as we asked earlier, is a complete picture of the how of its existence. For Peirce, the what question is descriptive, but the how question is normative. What is a genuine triadic relation? It is a sign that relates an object with an interpretant. The interpretant is the meaning of the sign which stands for the object. Now, any given interpretant is never final or complete because the sign which represents the object represents it only partially, in a determinate way or from a particular point of view. Any particular sign captures only an aspect of the object, for which reason Peirce calls the object at any determinate time in a process of semiosis the immediate object. The real or dynamical object is the object in its totality, being the sum of all possible representations which, in the course of semiosis, constrains any particular interpretation. Now, if the aim of the interpretation of a given sign is the truth, and any given interpretation is partial, then this implies for Peirce the need for a long series of inferences. But this presents a problem. As Peirce says, now the number of risks, the number of probable inferences which a man draws in his whole life is a finite one, and he cannot be absolutely certain that the mean result will accord with the probabilities at all. The fact of man's death means that his inferences or interpretations have a finite reach, which excludes the possibility of certainty in the interpretation of any given sign. The solution Peirce finds to this dilemma is the following. As we all well know, it seems to me that we are driven to this, that logicality inexorably requires that our interests shall not be limited. They must not stop at our own fate, but must embrace the whole community. This community, again, must not be limited, but must extend to all races of beings with whom we can come into immediate or mediate intellectual relation. It must reach, however vaguely, beyond this geological epoch, beyond all bounds. He who would not sacrifice his own soul to save the world is, as it seems to me, illogical in all his inferences collectively. Logic is rooted in the social principle. The relation and identification of one's personal interests with those of an indefinite community, unbounded by space and time, is Peirce's version of the Kierkegaardian self that relates to that which established the self-relation. So basically, this is the end of my analysis that I want to share with you here. I continue in the paper seeing how applying a Hegelian reading with the Hegelian dialectic to this description Kierkegaard gives of the self, and show how it has certain advantages, but in the end, the Peircean reading is better. Although Peirce and Hegel both have a reading of the God relationship, which is not Kierkegaardian. So there are definite definite points of contact and agreement between Peirce and Kierkegaard, although Peirce is very Hegelian in the way that he understands a sort of God relationship. So anyhow, this was what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your beautiful talk, Darin. Well, this is the moment to interchange opinions, comments. Paniel and Jorge, you want to talk? Paniel? I saw hands up.
Okay.
No?
No, it was we were clapping at Darin's marvelous presentation.
Okay. Specialist in semiotic, misunderstanding each other. The thing of the arm. May Ivo Ibri wants to talk?
Yes, I would like to greet all lecturers. It was an splendid session, splendid. And all talks were very deep and very brilliant. I can say that. So I don't have questions, or I have many questions, but I am a host, so I will open the floor for the audience that I know that they may have some questions. Excellent session. Congratulations to all of you.
Thank you very much for this space here in your beautiful conference.
Yeah.
Well, we're waiting.
André,
Yes, I
had a question.
André.
Yes, your turn, André.
I do have questions. Of course, the very first one that I am sorry I interrupted the flow by asking you, Catalina, about your work on photometric researches, because as I mentioned, it is very rare that the document is studied, and I had not paid attention to it myself. So you taught me some things about Peirce when he is actually trying to teach a lesson. Not only is he conducting an extremely serious type of scientific study, where he has also to come up with his own procedures, and he's very much aware of this. Because he did all of this work between 1872 and 1875, and then it took 3 years for the report, of course, to be written and composed and typeset. But really, those are the years where he is very much also studying such things as the logic of errors. And those are complex kinds of documents where he's working out how to account for errors in that kind of research. So he has indeed a great concern for precision and increasing that, and so you captured that. It has also that it comes with this scholarly spirit of the historian. doing his homework and studying all of the previous traditions and taking that as part of his own community of inquiry when he compares his data with others and tries to make them congruent in methods. So that is really wonderful. So my question had been really, when you looked at did you study photometric research from very deeply, even going into the tables of data to understand what it is that Peirce was doing, because you seem to quite master the subject?
Well, I'm studying it for several years, and it is difficult for me because I have a philosophical formation, and you need a physical formation. So I asked the help of both historians of science, historians of astronomy. For example, 10 years ago, I didn't could find any information of the astrometer or Solner's astrometer, but once I visited the observatory of Córdoba in Argentina, what was built for the same time, and who was in charge of that observatory was a disciple of Benjamin Peirce. They have an astrophotometer there. And it's something very curious because from Harvard, or I think so, they sent as not as, ¿cómo se dice? Prestar, Daring, as press?
They loaned.
They loaned the astrophotometer, but nobody used it because it was very difficult and they were interested in other things. So many people here in Argentina, nobody knows how the astrophotometer works. And they appeal to Peirce's works to know how did it work. So it's not this kind of information I need in order to profundize, to deep my study are not easy to find. But I know that you can, in a long run, dedicate your life to make a very little contribution to the understanding of something. So do I.
Well, I think that's really worthwhile because I have run to that kind of problem trying to make sense of what Peirce does when he draws all kinds of lines that have astronomical meanings. And then I would go to astronomers today to ask them, can you explain what Peirce is doing? And then they look at this and says, no, because we no longer do things this way today. And they don't have the historical background.
Yes, yes. Finally have the lucky that one historian in Argentina devoted several years in order to learn that. And I could saw an astrophotometer itself.
Well, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Because due to the time, I couldn't show you photographs of that.
Mm-hmm. Can I make one remark to Paniel? Because I really enjoyed your paper as well. I mean, I enjoyed all of our papers. But your research in Peirce's evolutionary cosmology, you are really trying to bring it into a contemporary kind of understanding. And I admire that. I am very much interested in the continuation of your research because it is not easy to bring the Peirce of the late 19th century, early 20th century as a metaphysician and cosmologist to resonate with the current models that are highly physical. And that is a real trouble. That's something that I will allude to this afternoon, but I encourage you to continue in this vein because we really need to fathom how Peirce's metaphysics can actually help, and you are saying it could help reframe, let's say, the metaphysics or the theory of reality that might help us better understand, perhaps even improve physical hypothesis. Is that right?
That's correct, Andrea. Thank you so much for your comment. It's very symptomatic that even early Persians like Gali, for example, they used to call Perseus cosmology as his black sheep. Nobody wanted to, he said, they said, oh, Perseus has a lot of interesting stuff to say about anti-Cartesianism and belief and the maxim, but when it comes down to the cosmology, he kind of went lula or or went a bit crazy. And I think it's a big shame that view is still somehow even present in us Persians. I did enjoy a lot reading Cosmos Noetos by Professor Ivo, because actually he wants to sort of, mine all this wealth of conceptual richness that I also like a lot about Alejandro's presentation, because it's this interrelatedness of the system that kind of is still very promising. Mm-hmm. And like I said to you in our correspondence, it's turn, and I think if physics was to have a semiotic turn, it will be very powerful. Heuristically, we will have a lot more resources to sort of explore and delve into the forming of hypotheses in physics, because at the moment there's a big debate in contemporary physics about where do they start the mathematical approach to it and when do they start the observational approach to it. And I think Peirce's metaphysics has and Peirce's methodology in general and pragmatist philosophy has the ability to connect these things in a very consistent and coherent way. Thank you, Andre.
Mm-hmm.
Maria Alejandra Madi wants to make a question or a comment.
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentations. They were brilliant. I'd like to ask something to Paniel and Jorge Alejandro, mainly about the epistemological consequence, not only about the cosmological approach, but also because of the evolutionism. I think that Peirce said that evolutionism, theory of continuity, and are related to fallibilism. So I think that they are completely interesting points to explore a little bit more this articulation between cosmology, evolutionism, and fallibilism in some way. And then I think that I will continue with Jorge Alejandro. I think that the semiotic approach, I think is completely linked with this fallibilism. I think the approach that there are not absolute laws, but yeah, that almost necessary laws, as Professor Ivo says, that it means like there is a cohabitation between laws and chance, and this has to be considered in any approach, in semiotic approach, to reality. So I'd like you to explore a little bit more these aspects. Thank you.
Would you like me to go first, Alejandro? Okay. Well, very briefly, but thank you for your comment. I appreciate what you're aiming at. I think I share with you that vision of Peirce's, this view of Peirce's doctrines and body of beliefs as a unity, and that's why I wanted to sort of underline the interconnectedness, because in a way, by adopting the pragmatic maxim, not only as a logical principle, but as a semiotic principle, we can develop a body of beliefs. And I think fallibilism, the cosmology, the different stages of this development, I do agree. I think there's an inner interconnectedness that has to be seen as a unity, as opposed to some different topics that Peirce studied over the years, but actually they didn't have an inner relatedness. realism, I tried to sort of underline that unity of Peirce's thought, and my key to that was his conception of universals. But nowadays, I tend to see that there's a bigger semiotic structure to it. There's a bigger semiotic aspect to it, and because just like you said, for example, fallibilism and cynicism, they're connected. Peirce said that cynicism is fallibilism objectified. How can you do these sort of assertions? Well, only if you see them as a unity, of course. And again, just like Alejandro presented all the modes of inference as interconnected with the categories, this can only be so if you have a sort of a unifying principle which, you know, kind of interconnects everything in a coherent way. So I thank you for your comment.
Okay.
Yes, Alejandra, thank you for your question also. And I think they are really interesting and important questions. That the epistemological consequence of what I'm doing is that, for instance, in science, if we put deduction as the last one, we pragmatic consequences is that the science is going to be secure, it's going to be certain all the time. But if we put induction at the end, we're going to have fallibilism. Induction is problematic. Induction is not safe. So the consequence is that we have to embrace fallibilism. And also you asked about the semiotic approach. It was the part that I have to put a part of my presentation, but I think that the architectonic of the system make us to have also an semiotic approach to the logical inferences. And I think that is lacking in Peirce. Peirce couldn't get a semiotic definition of the logical inference. I think that's lacking. And for instance, we need to be able to define an induction as a legisigns, for instance, at what kind of legisign. And I think all the logical inference, as I said in the paper, all of them are signs. And all of them are legisign symbolic arguments. So the thirdness of the classification of signs from 1903. But then we need to identify semiotically the difference. What's the semiotic difference between an abduction and induction? Or inside induction, what is the semiotic difference between a quantitative induction and a qualitative induction? First, he was very clear in the inferences, but I think the long classification of signs that is lacking, the 66 types of signs, we need to be able to locate the logical inference in those 66 types of signs.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question or comment.
Could I make a question to Alejandro?
Okay.
Well, you tackled one of those age-old questions. One of those age-old questions regarding the categorical ordering of the three kinds of inferences, and one always wonder why is it that Peirce himself had trouble with this. And you made a good case. I certainly, I agree with what you have done. But there are many different kinds of perspectives, which is why Peirce had trouble when you consider the distinction between analytical inference and ampliative inferences. Then deduction is quite separate indeed from the other two. As abduction tends to increase the depth, and induction tends to increase the breadth. And that was Peirce's initial approach to the three inferences back in the early 1860s, as he is coming out of his studies of syllogism, and he's still using syllogism to create those kinds of distinctions. And it may well be that what was part of what was sort of polluting his mind regarding how to organize those types of inferences. It's also that, as I had learned from Gérard Deledal a long time ago, it is not because you find a triad that the rule of precision applies to them. It could be that person is making distinctions that rely on discrimination and instead of precision. And it is also the case that just because we have three doesn't mean that they are arranged in a triadic pattern as Peirce would have it, because the ordinal ordering, first and then second and then third, is not quite equivalent to having first again second with the third in the middle. And so the counting sometimes can bring difficulty to decide what are we talking about. Now, it's one thing to talk about the order in which things happen within the part of science, and then to say, but that order is, we first did this and this, that and that, but that might not be the reflection of the triad itself. So hence the difficulty, but you found a good way of solving it. Thank you.
Well, Cassiano wants to speak too.
I do. I have a question. Thank you for your presentations, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm seeing now for the first time. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to make a question. It's not really a question, it's more like a provocation. And I guess it's for daring, but I might extend it to everyone else on the table, because I guess it's a more general topic. I guess it's, I address it to Daring because of the nature of his talk, which is more about the ends of life. It strikes me that when people ask about philosophy, oh, so you do philosophy, what do you study in philosophy? You study the meaning of life, and the answer is no. And that was a long time ago. Socrates did that. But in fact, everyone is, but that's what we do, in fact. And but well, it seems to me that by the presentations that we saw today, there's a difficult point in Peirce's philosophy, which is how can we understand particularities and differences which are meaningful and important to us without making reality to bend itself in the face of a mathematical abstractions. Because if we follow Peirce's strong advice to apply probabilities and statistical methods to philosophy and to the inquiry into human life, how do we deal with this difficulty? I would say I myself don't have an answer for that, so it's just a provocation. I mean, it's something that really strikes me when I read Peirce, that he tries to preserve what is most valuable in our lives and still claims that we should apply statistical methods and pursue inquiry and beliefs in the self-correction of induction and whatever. So that's my, thank you. That's it.
I think that's a wonderful provocation, and I am provoked. I am going to respond to that. I think it's a very important observation that you make. In general, Peirce's idealism is very similar to Hegel's idealism. Hegel has been very much criticized in the 20th century for the absolute system and everything is rationalized and blah, 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 blah. I think what saves Peirce is the fact that the three categories are absolutely insistent. So Peirce, Hegel ends up in thirdness, almost complete thirdness, And what I try to do in the end of my paper, which I did not present to you, is I try to show a more a Peirce more concentrated in secondness. So I tried to see how Kierkegaard can show us a Peirce that is a bit more existentialist. And so I have quotes from different parts of his writings where he talks about the very important role of doubt in investigation, and how the scientist, the true scientist, lives in a state of doubt, doesn't sit on his laurels and thirdness, but is always asking, where am I wrong? What are things, what is going wrong? So I think it's very important to, as Peirceans, that we try to honor the three different categories of the three different categories. In my case, personally speaking, especially secondness. I think that there are lots of different writers, different philosophers from the 20th century and today who are trying to go to the other, they're criticizing the idealist perspective without falling into a scientific, positivist, mere empirical point of view. I think that's a very important task that we have as philosophers, not only as Peirceans, but as philosophers. So to show not only the scientific thirdness of Peirce, but also his these things associated with secondness. So anyhow, that would be my response to your very interesting provocation. Thank you, Cassiano.
Sorry, we have time only to Ivo Ivry, last intervention.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. It's only a note, a very brief note to Alejandro. Your paper is very, very important because there is indeed a deep confusion among these three categories related to the logic of empire, which is firstness, secondness, and thirdness connected with abduction, deduction, and induction. And I would like to send to you a paper of mine, which title is the heuristic exclusivity of abduction in Peirce's logic of inquiry. And there are some argumentation that it's quite connected with your conclusion, that firstness is connected with abduction, secondness with deduction, and thirdness with induction. I think that the key problem of Peirce's own embarrassment with this matter is that I suppose that he, by himself, he doesn't realize that the form is already implied in the abduction. The form, but it's a form that must be revealed, must be try to come to light by deduction. Deduction is the operation that will reveal the form that is implied in the abduction. And in some parts of Peirce's embarrassment, where he said that, well, deduction is form, then it must be thirdness. I think that he forgot that the form is originally in abduction, but it's a hidden form that must be revealed by another form of argumentation, which is a deduction. Then in short, I sent you this paper, and we can continue this dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Yeah, I read your paper. Please send it to me, please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ivo, and thank you all of you for your attendance. It's a pity we can't go out for lunch together with caipirinhas and beers and so on. So I must say bye-bye to you. We return at 2 p.m. for the conferences. Okay, bye-bye.
Congratulations to all of you. Excellent
Thank you
session.
very much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for your comments and questions.
The